with the estimate of the Confederates concerning the war strategy of creating chaos where David would have provided order. They have estimated the $100,000 a week traded on the options at 4,000%, making the 4 million, which, having been contracted, would be then exchanged to a buyer who would be providing an equivalent value of resources off of their acceptance of the risk. And thus, all records would demonstrate David having been trading in the red or negative. And to this extent, the estimates for various things, such as the Hawaii fires, which they believe David would have counteracted, if not stopped directly, on the basis of whatever strategy they were conducting, such as the double agents in the Hawaiian government having actively been a part of plans to set the fires, such as with space lasers, and thus the action of the use of the microwave technology engaging in the hyperheat, which would have melted metal, would have generated the inability for normal security measures to be preventative of the issue, as it would be uh, damages of war by the Confederacy, which, being supported by double agents in the Hawaiian government who would block civilians from leaving the fire or danger area, would have actively been arranged as proven conspiracies of the Confederates against the Americans, and thus the insurance from David being proven from that estimate from the 4 million a week would have provided the insurance structures necessary to protect them after the damages, which had to be removed in order for them to receive the injury, as their suffering was the goal. And this type of arrangement, divided a million different ways, including their prospects of selling the United States to China and others, would facilitate the mechanism of their betrayal of the United States, guaranteeing these damages, requiring them to have removed David to make sure that the intelligence oversight enforcement mechanism classified above the CIA and other intelligence agencies would have been undermined, and thus the action of undermining them by compromising the intelligence, advancing their capability of sabotaging the American security mechanisms, prevents the covert function of watching the watchers, and to this extent guarantee the sale and prove that it is still viable, and thus the action of the United States completely collapsing into the anarchy, and thus the action of the planned anarchy generates the position of the sales and distributions. And since the position is anarchy by the anarcho communists of the white supremacist Confederacy, you have materialized the ability to betray their oath, and thus the action of the expenses to those that they would have sold it to would be engaged in the defense of the country by the individuals repelling it, which would be decreased by the increase of chaos by the subversion of the reduction of rights, such as the Second Amendment, and given false legitimacy, such as the position of double agent sheriffs, who would then engage in the function of undermining them by just across the line legitimacy, which requires them to actively increase the line until the people are fully vulnerable, at which point the invasion would be more successful, which would then generate the counteraction by the Confederates getting revenge, quote unquote, against them for the action, as the sale is no longer viable and they are pretending to do national security concerning the thing that they would have sold. But as anarchists, they were always going to break the agreement. To this extent, the complications grow infinitely. And to the mechanism that happens, they having arranged for the war in Ukraine by the advanced strategic interests of Russia being compromised by the Confederacy, poking it into the fight in Ukraine for the special operations, generates the obligation for David to have maximized his full diversity of options and the minimizing of flags in order to generate the ease of his success in the mission, which would have required David to have been in Cambodia a year or more before that action, which requires the function of the seeds having been laid as the excuse for the cover story, such as Lindsay, and thus the action of Angelina Jolie, who is an original associate, engaging in the mass donations, getting the respect of the Cambodians, which would have been a trade with David and her, in order to promote the nobility of her adopted children, which would then facilitate the groundwork of David's later engagement, and thus the action of David's later engagement of using the 4 million a week in order to engage in investments in the advancements at the time that he would have gone on the quote unquote vacation, which would then materialize his investments in the red in that location, which then would sell the business opportunities under the various exchanges, which would then complicate itself until there would be a consistent bottom line investment, which would then generate its massive loan, which then would generate the capability of its automation to the person that would have been buying it, as the company would be massively in the red at David's control. Having sold it, it would transfer away from under the agreed price, and thus they, having bought the thing at the matured thing from the basis of their confidence, adjusted by the algorithms of David's brokerage, would then materialize the consistent income, which would then materialize the function of the advancing investments into the area. And this would generate the position of David's game, which would then vary itself into an appropriate, age appropriate version of itself, which would then be downsized into a Game Boy type arrangement or handheld system to play the game, which would actively incorporate the lessons into it, which is some variation of whatever game the thing would be. Most consistent theory is a version of Bannerlord 2, which would then materialize the function of the added complications, where they would play the game while doing the lessons, which would automatically generate the grades, which would be a part of David's contract with a school that he would have gone to in order to have done the lessons at the normal accepted yada 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 yadas, and thus the contracts for the school would have had each contract with the parents to advance the thing under the terms and services and to meet the quotas of the agreements, which would be a loss until the investments saw maturity, which the normal investment system for a company doesn't start seeing returns until 7 years, and they don't really become stable until 10 years. And so this is the normal assumption on this arrangement. But this, as the active cover story, materializes the function of that as a pretense to win the Confederates actually engage in the coup in Ukraine, triggering the Russians to engage in the reaction where David would need the highest percentage likelihood of the lower flags in order to acquire his special operation mission in the counter of the function, which then would materialize his undercover talks with the relevant politicians and businessmen and etc., which then would materialize the full security mechanism, gaining the viable solutions, stopping the mass killings, and thus the action of the senseless deaths would have been prevented and reestablished the security, which, having been arranged by the Confederates, has the West wizards, which the Russians are concerned about, creating perversions inside their society, such as the infatuation with the Confederates and spreading their transsexuality and homosexuality and others, which is offensive to Putin and others. And to this extent, the mechanism of these poisons having actively been proven in the spreading of disease by J. Sekulow Civil War, engaging in the function of collateral damage weapons, which is designed to hurt as many people arbitrarily as possible. would then actively be incorporated into that conflict, as well as the use of depleted Ukrainian, you, the depleted nuclear waste ammunitions, which would permanently injure the land and stop them from rehabilitating, as the purpose is the conflict inside of Ukraine, which would then use this in order to permanently injure Ukrainian land, which is the mission of the Confederates, who want to destroy the Ukrainians and the Russians. And they want the Ukrainians to die killing the Russians, which then weakens Russia, which then facilitates their capability of overthrowing the Russians from having set up this proxy war, which has just about the least to do with the Ukrainians outside of the actual actors acting behind the scenes, who actively demand the prospects and increasing of war. Now, since the counteraction has David's vulnerability in this arrangement, they would have actively sought the sabotage and counteractions by their espionage war, engaging in the undermining of all support structures for the defamation in the smear factory as well as the terror factory, where they train, recruit, and advance uh, basically Hitler's youth to engage in the wartime attacks of terrorist plans advanced by the FBI and others in the creation of phantom cells in order to radicalize them for the specific mission of undermining the United States, and similar to the function of the Fast and the Furious program, the mission is the failure of the public cover story, which is the mission that they publish to Congress in their contempt for Congress, which then materializes the function of the successes of their intended damages for the Confederacy under their higher loyalties to corruption and anarcho communism, which then retaliates against their assumption on the basis of the compromised intelligence, which then creates complications by their terrorists until failure. And thus the defamation is sold, and thus the reduction of all values, the normal social values, which would normally be communicating someone's status, importance, and norms, and things that they would normally be interested in, can be sold as an inferior value if they get the damages for the appearance of the reduced status, and thus the action of those sabotages is designed as an illusion to sell the thing. And since microwaves are a form of light, and light is used in the mechanism of mind control or the use of having your brain be able to interact with the interface of a computer, generates the capacity of the intelligence secret information from projects MK Ultra and COINTELPRO, in a combination of the terrorist operations by the use of mental manipulations and physical abuse by the use of this light, then materializes the function of the injuries, which then prevent the person from being able to beat the illusion, repackaging the function until no one wants to do the thing they need to do because of the illusion and not just because they're being assaulted, which then traps them permanently into the assault, which they cannot escape because the means of their escape was passing the illusion from their perception, which then makes them guilty of the primary offenses of their entrapment, which means it wasn't entrapment because they intended to make the failures, and thus the action of them not being tampered with, the victims being tampered with that they needed to use, which they didn't use because of the illusion, materializes the devil religion's advance as a technique of war in order to have conquered these United States in the sales and distribution of people instead of money, which the Confederates do under their anarcho communism or national capitalism from each of their plantations. And this materializes the normalization of their slave rates, which then provides them slaves for their plantations, which then would require David's original associates in order to protect him under the obstructed insurances, such as the ones from his family or some original associate from work, like uh, Donald Trump or Taylor Swift or any of the infinite other connections at the highest levels which David would have under the obstructed contracts absolutely have been conducting active business with, including the function of the migration routes for all of the traded services, which then would have actively amplified both in this function as the cover stories when David would have been doing his secret missions, which create subversions to these international problems, which, similar to the ones that I've been discussing, many of them have not matured yet, and thus the action of them still being classified would prevent me from mentioning them. But the previous ones, like the arrangement of 9/11 as Project Northwoods, is a perfect example. The use of the creation of the anarcho-communism for the creation of bubbles and bursts in order to collapse the general American public, the pension bombs in order to collapse the police forces, which, having assumed that they would just be able to extort the public infinitely for the resource, could deny the thing when, as long as shit rolls downhill, they'll always be fine, but they themselves were collapsed under the pension bomb fraud. These types of arrangements are infinitely diverse in complications, which would have actively been the actual services they believe David would have been doing, which requires at all cost his complete and utter devastation and complete poverty, and thus the complications and terrorist operations from their hot war and their espionage creates the complications to failure, which then prevents the successes of each of the things, which are then undermined and obstructed, and thus the process of being able to send in the proper paperwork being obstructed becomes impossible, requiring functions like the duel, which David doesn't want to engage with, as that gives the Confederates too much legitimacy in order to acquire what he's owed by compelling Congress to acknowledge his title for the pursuit of the remedy, which is the acquiring of the declaration of war against the threats to the Constitution by its most malicious adversaries, would then facilitate the function of the correction against it, but this would require them to have any loyalties to the United States and not to their fellow members in the government, which have acquired the position by voter fraud and other subversions, which they, having under common courtesies of their positions, would have actively tried to protect against the subversion, which they would have to ignore in order to acknowledge what David is owed, which then certifies what he's owed in order to make the correction, which means they have to predetermine to support the United States before having the vote in order to choose whether or not the United States or one of its enemies should have control over its jurisdiction. So, Catch 22, you understand the complications behind that and the problems inherent with keeping their oath of office and not breaking it, which would be demonstrated by ignoring what David Bowles has owed, and thus the action of allowing the war of attrition to make these complications to failure, which would facilitate David's inability to do national security, which would then prevent them from succeeding, which would then allow the people that they're protecting to stab them in the back when they overthrow the United States government and no longer have a fake reason to tolerate them. But their death in America's suffering, the world needing America, no longer having it, is worth them keeping appearances of being polite to the war-hungering murder hobos and their infamous lynch mobs, radicalizing the infection to compelled poverty. Now, keeping all of this in mind, the function of aiding and abetting from those various schemes in order to incorporate people into becoming guilty of their offenses, which they are victims of, then materializes the function of the transfer of the resources, such as their estimates of David's basic systems, which would have compromised them and thus put them into federal debts by David's companies as the function of David selling them the complication of the contract, which he would have been providing to them, then materializes their automated purchase of the options and its exchanges for the resources which he would have obtained for his profits, which they are obligated to pay for, and thus the position of their order, having not been paid for, requires the correction into their payment of that structure, then materializes the function of them undermining their own successes in that contract, which they think that they're hurting David for under the contract that he's already sold to them, and thus the mechanism of them receiving the injury, having created their own sabotage of their own company is their risk and not David's, and then materializes the function of their losses at David's equivalent profits, and thus the mechanism does not transfer as a loss to David, but it does transfer as a loss to them who thought that they would pull off this scam. And many similar anti-scam systems would have actively been incorporated into David's faculties, and thus the use of the terror factory in order to engage in these subversions by the function of the surveillance agencies, which then give a fake position of control for the human trafficking, giving it a false justification in order to maintain their competent control over the system so that they can engage in that sabotage, then materializes them undermining the value of the company, which is their liability and not their victims, and thus the action of them receiving the injury from the losses from their damages is basically them breaking their own company and losing it for themselves. And as the function of David without this aversion would have competently been known to be able to pull it off, the algorithm would have provided the highest confidence cost, and thus the mechanism of David sustaining his extreme wealth would then just transfer normally, as they would be forced to pay for their losses under the federal debts, which would then compensate or cover the function of any potential risk that David would be having in the mass conversion of the economy back into status quo. Now, the function of David's brokerage only trading companies that would have his insurance as incorporating themselves as a part of the recycling of the resources, materializing their access to the market potential from the bonus credit system, which would conduct automatic purchase bundles, would then materialize the function of their sales and distributions and stocks, etc., to automatically be understood as being fully insured, requiring David's active adaptive adjustments to that system with their promotion and encouragement, which without the obstruction would have been made legal into a version which by definition would not be subversive or corruptible or something that somebody else would use for evil consistently as a negative exploit, unless the action of the lack of the vulnerability materializes the legitimacy under its complications, which requires further examination, which I do not possess at the moment, so that I cannot confirm nor deny any specific policy. To this extent, many of these complications would be put into the propaganda of the game, which then would materialize the function of David's system having positions for the other players to fill into the position or for them to venture off on their own in order to acquire quests alternative. And thus the action materializes into the function of them actively being guided under the lesson plans from each of the various things that should happen. Now, if you're doing a Bannerlord type of game, then you have the leader and the subordinate units, and thus the contracted players being under the thing would then conduct all of their lessons into the mechanism of them expressing it into the game, which would then have translated it into whatever they needed to do, which then is verifiable to all of the others as the copied thing, which then proves each and every one of their grades in an infinite challengeable way in order to make any argument or counter argument, unless the action of anyone participating or not participating playing or not playing, participating as the success at a certain level or failing that level would then instantly be verifiable and not pollutable at all, and thus the action of the grade not being challengeable outside of direct corruption materializes the counter to said corruption, and thus the action materializes into the verifiable protected grade, which gives everyone the maximum amount of confidence. And thus the action of tournaments and similar functions in order to express the benign expression of these things would then compare each of the grades, which would then facilitate a hierarchy of the expression in the game, which would have all of the distractions necessary to keep the age-appropriate parties particularly involved in the situation and eager to expand their system, which would actively demonstrate on who needs to receive promotions and grades and which ones need to be held back and which ones are on pace. And now for something completely different.